Hiya, I'm Anya, and I'm here to talk about a fun subject that everyone's gonna love. Today, I'm talking about trauma. Now, I previously recorded a very long video on trauma talking about what I mean by it, what I mean when I say it, how trauma can come to us, the different levels and layers of it, things like that, and even getting a little bit vulnerable about my own traumas that I've tried to work with and deal with. But man, it was a little bit too much, so sometimes you just need to kiss. So, let's keep it simple. What is trauma? As I'm referring to it, trauma is a collection of all of the crap that has accumulated in our heads over the years from past lessons and past ideologies that have just shaped who we are and our self-concepts, our self-schemas, and shaped how we look at the world. Lessons that have turned into repetitive thought patterns that have shaped our self-concepts, our visions of who we are, and ultimately our schemas of the world and what we perceive the world to be. Trauma is what makes us look at the world and view it the way we do, which ultimately decides how we're going to act in the world. And we all carry a little bit of trauma. Trauma can be as small as lessons and thought patterns that you were taught as a child, but as big as the effect of living through wars in war zone areas. Obviously, those are two very different things and are going to lead to different levels, different layers of trauma. But both are going to equally contribute to the way you see the world, the way you see yourself, and how you interact with the world itself. So how do we get trauma? Well, like I sort of hinted at just a minute ago, trauma can come to us from experiences, especially very traumatic experiences. It doesn't have to be as big as the example of living through war in a war zone area. It can be, something minor that happened in your life, that happened in your formative years when you're a child and your brain is still growing and developing, and you're essentially trying to make sense of the entire world around you. So trauma can come from little experiences from those formative years that may have grown with you to make you see the world in another way. And any of these experiences, no matter how small, have the potential to affect our self-views and our schemas of the world overall. For many of us, trauma comes in the form of lessons that we've been taught as children, whether from parents and guardians or other adults in our lives, teachers, more parental type figures, maybe aunts, uncles, grandparents, lessons that were handed down that maybe someone taught you as a child in an effort to keep you safe or an effort to make you aware of something, but you as a child took it in, and from your experiences in the world, it shaped into something that may no longer be useful to you in your adult life. I'll get back into that in a second. Right now, I'm trying to stay focused. Let's focus on where the trauma comes from before we get to where it goes. So again, they can come in the form of lessons. They're things that have been taught and ingrained in us, often from trusted sources that shape our outlook. If you think about it, when we're young, we tend to believe the adults around us. For many of us, we have to. That's what you have to do as a child. You have to incorporate a level of trust in the adults around you to know that they're guiding you in the right way. They're helping you in the right direction. And you, as a child, don't have all that you need in order to survive in the world on your own, so you do have to rely on the adults around you. So as children, we trust the adults around us to share wisdom that they, as adults, have. And yet, most of us grow up into adults and realize that even as an adult, we don't have it all figured out. There are countless memes about it, like, oh, I need an adult. Well, you are an adult. I need an adulter adult. As we grow from children to adolescence to young adulthood and then ultimately into our adult years, with our, fully formed brains in our mid to late 20s and then beyond, we look at it and go, I don't have it all figured out. And yet, we can't really look back at those lessons that we learned as children with our adult minds and think that maybe the adults then didn't have it all figured out. And often the reason why we don't do this is because it's already there. It's already there in our brains, in the old noodle, in the noggin, whatever word. I don't have words, but it's all there in our heads, and it's just become a part of us and a part of who we are. And we don't really think about having to question it because we just trust that this is right and this is what the world is, because it's just become part of us. As we've had these lessons and we've come to accept them as truths, we've also had experiences that are confirming these things, whether it's reading a book where the plot or the theme connects to that idea of our own lessons that we've been taught, or we see a film or a TV show where something like that happens, or we see something that happens in the news that just confirms it. It just reinforces some of these lessons that maybe aren't correct. This is what I mean when I say it can shape the way we view ourselves and our place in the world, but it can also shape how we see the world overall. Because we have the lesson in our head, we refuse to be able to see another point or another side, and to try to consider another point or a side can actually be very scary and even a little bit shattering to our own self ideas and perceptions. And a lot of people aren't comfortable with that. But again, getting ahead of myself. So I'm going to try to rewind a little bit before we get there, okay? So again, the lessons, the trauma that you learned, it's been confirmed in different ways throughout your life. It was confirmed by the news you saw, the films you watched, the books you read. When you saw something that aligned with the negative thought processes that you've been taught to have, it essentially just confirmed for you that this is the way the world is. So trying to look back as an adult, even in recognizing that adults don't always have all the answers, again, it's already there. It has already ingrained itself in your brain, and your vision of the world has already been created. Now, this might not be an issue if your trauma ain't all that negative, but what if it is? So I'm gonna just offer some examples, because it's very hard to conceptualize the idea of trauma if we don't have an idea of what we're talking about. And let me stress, these are 2 examples. They are examples that I think are probably pretty relevant to other people's lives and experiences, but they are not going to demonstrate every single person's trauma, because every single person's trauma and life lessons they've learned are very different. But roll with me on them so that maybe it might awaken a thought in your head of something that has been affecting you most of your life. So here's some examples. A lot of parents try to instill some level of caution in their children. The whole stranger danger and stuff like that. They teach children that only certain individuals can be trusted, and that most strangers, if not all strangers, cannot be trusted. This is inherently a good lesson overall, right? As I talked about before, children often have to be trusting of their parents and the people around them because they rely on the adults in their lives to take care of them. So kids do need to be taught that not all strangers can be trusted. So inherently, not a bad lesson. But depending upon your childhood understanding of that lesson, the level of anxiety or worry you might have had, and also the intensity with which your parents taught that lesson, it could warp the way you grow with handling relationships. And as children, our relationships are not that complex. But as anyone who's grown into an adult knows, as you get older, your relationships do get more complex. And a big part of that is due to the changing brain as it moves from childhood to learn the basics and essentials and to get a good grip on who can be trusted, and relationships, play, things like that are all shaping your ideas, your mind, and all things like that. But then you start hitting the age of adolescence and your relationships become a lot more complex. You start developing more intimate feelings and maybe even start considering romantic partners. This is an age where social connections outside of the home become much more important because it's kind of an evolutionary mechanism that we need. Because what is adolescence if not the time period where our bodies and minds are starting to change to become adult-like so we can perform the act of mating, as unsexy as it is? That is what the time period of adolescence is meant to be. And in that, You need to make connections outside of the home because mating, whether or not you engage in it, whether or not you are someone who wants to have kids or not, you can't be having romantic relationships within the home. So if you're someone whose childhood lessons about not being able to trust strangers was a bit too strict, that's something that your childhood brain could have held on to, leading to having trust issues with every single relationship you have. And if further experiences in your childhood confirm this, a kid in the playground pushing you down, a classmate tattling on you for something insignificant, that can further confirm for you this idea that people outside your home are not to be trusted, which is going to complicate your relationships as you grow into adolescence, as you grow into adulthood. We might want to think we grow out of this, but if we're honest, a lot of times we don't. A lot of times we end up continuing to carry these negative thought patterns, this trauma into our relationships with our family, with our friends, with our romantic partners. We can carry those trust issues, as I'm trying to demonstrate, into each of our relationships. And maybe it manifests in different ways. Maybe it looks different for each person, and maybe it evolves a little bit with you, but it always comes. It always comes with you. And that is the harm of not addressing our negative thought patterns and ultimately our trauma. Another example, if you learned a lot of shame and guilt surrounding sex, bodies, desire, this is something that could equally carry over with you from childhood into your romantic relationships. And listen, I am no stranger to how sex ed is handled in the United States, okay? There's often lots of shame and fear and guilt with sex, bodies, and desire. This can be for many reasons, extremely religious views, whether from parents or society that's just trying to force that view, or it can also be because parents think that the fear that can be instilled through things like guilt and shame is the best way to handle discouraging their kids from having sex at too young an age. But that still warps how we look at issues like that. And when we live in a world that is absolutely saturated with sexual imagery and content, that's going to enforce a lot of negative beliefs regarding sex, bodies, and desire, and ultimately what we bring into our romantic relationships. And if you want more on that, check out my other video on why good sex ed is very much needed. Now, keeping these negative thought patterns or trauma, it might not affect you much in your daily life, but at some point, something is going to happen that is going to awaken or trigger these thoughts to arise again. And a lot of times, those things that awaken it or trigger it can be there to remind us that it is still here and it is still living within our heads. It could be a friend talking about their different trust issues and you realizing that their reality doesn't fit in with the reality that you see and experience. It could be someone else talking about their own sexual relationship and you realizing that there's no shame in their words, like you often experience. At times like this, we are being called to address the trauma, to dig into it and to look at it. But many of us don't. Why? Because a lot of us just push it down and ignore it. It might leave us feeling shaky and weird for a while, but eventually we just get back to a normal life and move on. Move on. Who cares? It's not bothering us anymore. But that's not going to stop more experiences or conversations coming up that may reawaken those weird feelings and thoughts again. So what do we do about it?